It was Eastern Europe's most brutal and deadly war of the last half of the 20th century. Although the direct cause was the breakup of Yugoslavia, it had its roots in the fall of the Soviet Union and festering animosities which date back to World War II. By the end of the war, over 100,000 had been killed, over 2 million displaced, and heinous war crimes had been committed. This is the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, 1992 to 1995. This is Brotherhood Unity, and you're watching What Does That Piece Do? Welcome to this tutorial for Brotherhood Unity by Compass Games, as designed by Tomislav Čipčić. This video is meant to give you a good enough understanding of the game so you can get playing right away, but it's no replacement for the thorough rulebook and player aids that come with the game, so keep those nearby when playing. If you're into games like this and want some quick teaches, as well as discussion on game design and the history represented in the games, please like and subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. So let's get into this game, but be warned that this is a war game that deals with heavy topics like civilian casualties. It does so tastefully in my opinion. Just make sure you're on the right frame of mind to tackle these types of topics. If you're ready, let's throw down that map board, get out those chits, dice, and cards, and let's get started. Brotherhood and Unity is a point-to-point, card-driven game that depicts a three-way battle between the Serbians, Croatians, and Bosnians over the future of the former nation of Yugoslavia. Players representing each faction will play cards to strengthen and mobilize their units on the map to ultimately engage the other players' factions in order to take over spaces. The cards may also be used for their event text and in other various ways to mitigate risk for their faction throughout the game. Each player's faction will attempt to achieve their victory by taking over individual spaces and ultimately entire regions on the map. Capturing the right combination of spaces will increase their overall strategic will, which is the game's overall scoring system. Factions are all vying for different levels of strategic will to achieve their victory and must also capture all the regions required for that victory over the course of 4 full turns. Otherwise, there is a final scoring system to determine the overall winner. So let's start by understanding the faction pieces. Each player has a certain amount of standard units that they start the game with. A good amount of these will be on the board at the beginning of the game, and more may be introduced via reinforcements at the start of each turn. There's also elite units that are the same color for each faction. Those come into the game via event cards. All of those in matching colors are the domestic units. So yellow for Serbia, blue for Croatia, and green for Bosnia. There's also a certain number and combination of foreign units that may be introduced by card play. Serbia has 3 distinct armies. Croatia has 1 but 2 different types of unit within that army, and Bosniak just has 1 type. All the unit types have regular and reduced side. The numbers along the bottom from left to right indicate the combat factor, or CF, loss factor, or LF, and movement factor, MF. As you can see, the reduced side just means the combat factor is lower for each piece, but being reduced means there's a greater chance of that piece being blown off the map soon. I'll explain combat, loss, and movement factors shortly as I get into operations. The symbols on the units themselves shows a minor difference between some of the types of units. The standard units just have the X through the rectangle, but if they have this extra oval in the middle, those are mechanized units. The main difference is that these units may advance 1 more step after a successful attack. Again, more on that later. Units of the same faction can mix and mingle in the same space on the map however the player wants as they move across the map, but note that the stacking limit is 3 units of any type for that faction, which is enforced at the end of the player's action round. Units from differing factions will never be in the same space at the same time. Another faction has to conduct combat to take over a space that is another player's units. There's a few other miscellaneous pieces, like entrenchments, which I'll explain shortly. They're available for all players. There's 2 UN safe area pieces and 1 tunnel piece. Those are all brought into the game by card effects from the Bosnian deck. There are also pieces to mark whether a unit is low supply, and they can be flipped to note out of supply. All other pieces are meant to mark spaces on the map as players take over control over a space or a region. And these track markers for strategic will, foreign attitude, and the game turn. Now, let's look at the closer details of the map. The map is made of individual spaces connected by paths that make up 14 different regions and 1 city of Sarajevo, which is zoomed in at the bottom left of the board. There are 2 types of spaces on the map. Regular spaces are in black lettering, but key spaces are in red capitals and underlined. More on the importance of those in a minute. Each space within Bosnia-Herzegovina will start off friendly to one faction as noted by the coat of arms and light shading in the space. The white cross on the red shield is Serbian friendly. Red and white check on the light blue background is Croatian friendly. And the green shield with a white slash on a light green background is Bosniak friendly. Throughout the game, as players other than the faction noted on the space move into that space and take over it, it will flip friendly to the new faction and you'll place the appropriate marker on it. As mentioned, players will get strategic will points by taking over the regions that are depicting their icon on that region space. You'll notice them as they don't have any connecting lines to them. For example, Kazinska Krajina can be claimed by either Bosniaks or Serbians as noted by their 2 flags next to the spot that shows region control. Notice the flags are quite different from the shields, so this may be tricky to keep straight when you're first learning the game. Keep the player aids nearby to help you. This region starts off in the hands of the Bosniaks, so take a look at the numbers below the name of the region. That 3 means at least 3 spaces within that region must be friendly to a faction before the whole region scores in their favor. And that asterisk indicates the number of key spaces, the ones in red capitals, that need to be claimed by the other faction before the region scores in that new controlling faction's favor. So if the Serbs came in and took control of at least 3 spaces, and one of them being Bihak, the Serbians would score the number of strategic will points in parentheses, taking away that number of points from the Bosniaks. You replace the Bosniak marker on that region with the Serbian marker. That would be +4 for the Serbians, -4 for the Bosniaks. But there's also point swings for taking over the individual key spaces. More on that later though as we get into gameplay. Swing on over to another region, Posavina, as an example. Either the Serbians or Croatians can score this region, and it doesn't start out in either faction's control. This region requires 4 spaces to be friendly controlled, including all 3 of the key spaces in that region, for a total of 6 strategic will points. Place the control marker if either faction grabs that region. One thing I will point out, which may make the board state difficult to read for players not used to strictly counter-based games, is the region control markers. They may be hard to notice when glancing at the board. In a recent game, I actually used colored cubes for the factions, 1 for each faction that could claim the region, and a second cube is put in place if that faction actually controlled the region. Some regions, including Sarajevo, will only score for 1 faction. This multicolored map guide on the player aid may help visualize the potential scoring options even further. There are other spaces just outside of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and they're called foreign spaces, which will keep the main units in supply on the board. Foreign units will also be deployed here, depending upon the faction they support. Regular domestic units can't willingly move into these spaces, but they can retreat back into them if they're pushed back in combat. Some spaces on the map have terrain, including mountains, cities, swamps, and rivers. These only affect attacks and not regular movement, although some may affect the advance after attack movement that happens when an attack is successful. More on that later. Entrenchments may also come into play. When completed, they give the defender an advantage and the attacker a disadvantage in combat. Since we're looking closely at the map, let's now get into the initial setup. As you'll see in some of the spaces, there's 1 or 2 units of the various faction colors in these spaces, meaning 1 or 2 standard starting units of that faction go into those spaces during setup. So those are the 464 units from Serbia, 364 from Croatia, and 362s for the Bosniaks. Set all those units in their spaces. As noted, all the spaces have a default friendly space indicator, but not all spaces have units to start. Whenever those spaces change their friendly status, you'll use one of these markers to indicate it, but for now, you'll set those aside. You don't need them for setup. What you will need is the region marker for any regions that are already controlled by a faction, if at all. Again, feel free to use my cube method mentioned before if you think this will help you visually. Set the strategic will markers to show each faction at 30, and place the foreign attitude markers on the first space for each region. Foreign attitude represents the inclination of foreign powers towards your faction. If you deploy foreign troops, as you'll see in a little bit, this decreases your reputation and you become labeled a warmongering faction. There's negative consequences to having your FA drop too low. On intervention level 1, that's -3 or 4, all movement factors for that faction are reduced by 1. There's no strategic deployment and there's no advance after attack. But on intervention level 2, all those restrictions apply, plus NATO will start to bomb that faction, potentially removing their units each action phase. But don't worry, there are ways to push that track back in the right direction for you as you sway the international community to see your faction's point of view. Place the turn track on turn 1 and note the icons and the faction order for that turn. Turn order goes Serbian, Croatian, Bosniak for the first 2 turns. Then turns 3 and 4 it reverses. And these symbols show how many cards each faction draws on that turn and how many reinforcements they can place. Serbians start off strong, drawing 7 cards, the other 2 factions only drawing 5. And Serbians place all of their standard unit reinforcements on that turn. Now, on top of that, Bosniaks have a -2 dice roll modifier in battle, -1 in the second turn. Then things start to even out for them. As you can probably guess, Serbians start aggressive, but Bosniaks are on the back foot for the first few turns. But that's looking ahead. Now to focus on this first turn. You'll do things in the order of the symbols, drawing cards, assessing those cards, then placing reinforcements. So let's construct those draw decks. Each faction has their own unique deck. Use the cards marked early and early late for the first 2 turns, and starting turn 3, we'll rebuild the decks with the rest of the cards available. Shuffle those early and early/late cards together, each faction drawing the number required for that turn, and assess them before placing your reinforcements. So now's a good time to understand the cards. Players that are used to card-driven games will find this format familiar. For the most part, you'll be playing the cards for either their action points in the top left or for the text as written on the cards as the event. Certain cards can just be played during the player's turn, laying the card out and stating, "I'll play this for the event," but some may be played during combat as dice roll modifiers, for example, or some may interrupt another player's action. Some will even say "use for operations," which will allow you to trigger the event and do operations, which are a specific type of action those points in the top left can be used for. Those cards are marked offensive, and I'll break down the difference between action and operation in a moment. The other label you'll find on some cards is foreign units, and those do exactly that. They bring the foreign units into play. The player will be allowed to deploy them right away, but doing so will cause the foreign attitude track to drop by 1, which again isn't good. You can leave them in your reserve box to deploy them at the beginning of a later action round, but either way, it affects the player's FA track. Foreign units must be placed on the corresponding foreign spaces on the edges of the map or the connected space within supply. Any Bosniak or Croatian units are supplied by Croatian space marked CRO. Serbian SDG units must be supplied by the YUG spaces, and Serbian SVK and NOZB by CRA spaces. These supplied spaces must be able to trace a friendly path connected by spaces controlling that faction back to their designated space. The events otherwise are all pretty straightforward and describe what that card is capable of. But now let's look at the possible activities that the points can be used for. Points on the cards can be used for any one of the following actions. Operations, which are further divided into movement, entrenchment, and attack. Strategic redeployment, replacement, and diplomatic action. If a player is spending their points on operations, it can be any combination of those 3 operations, but only operations. Likewise, if they're spending points on strategic redeployment, the points are only spent on that and nothing else. You can't mix strategic redeployment with replacement or replacement with any mix of operations. Now let's further dive into operations. When spending points on operations, those points activate that number of spaces with that player's units. If there's multiple units in each space, they may take different types of operations. Those operations include movement. Activating a unit or units will allow the units to move based on their movement factor, that number in the bottom right. Each movement into a friendly controlled space costs just 1 MF. Each into a space that isn't friendly controlled costs 2. Note that movement can only be into empty spaces. If you are adjacent to an enemy faction, the only way to clear them out is with a successful attack. For example, if Bosniaks activated one of their standard units with an MF of 2 in Foka, they can move into Gorazd for 1 MF, then on to Visegrad for 1 more MF, and that's the end of their movement. Alternatively, that unit could go into Serbian-friendly Gacko for 2 MF, and movement ends there. That unit could not go from Foka to Gorazd to Sokolak, as that final space is Serbian controlled, costing 3 MF total, which that unit does not have. And also remember the effect of the foreign attitude track on movement. If your FA is -3 or lower, that's at level 1 sanctions, MF is reduced for all units of that faction by 1. Tread slowly as the international community is not thrilled with your actions. If moving into a key space that was controlled by another faction, that space was empty, at the end of the turn that means that key space has been captured and is now controlled by the acting player. Mark the control as such and reward the faction 3 strategic will points and take away 3 strategic will points from the faction that lost it. However, that comes at a cost to the faction capturing the space. -1 on the foreign attitude track. You've created a refugee crisis which reduces your international reputation. In fact, if you're a non-Bosniak faction that moves into a UN safe area that's free of Bosniak units and is placed by the Bosnian card, your FA will dip even lower. If the capture of this space means that the faction now controls the region, having met the requirements for number of spaces and key spaces controlled, and it's one that they're eligible to control, now adjust the region control marker and award the points to the faction capturing it, removing strategic will points for the faction that just lost it. And even if it is a region that they can't score themselves, if it does take that control away from a faction that can score the points, we'll take away the points from the formerly controlling faction. Entrenchment is the next operation. For 1 action point, a player may start an entrenchment in a space they have units by placing the marker at that space on the in progress side. Or they can finish an entrenchment that is already in progress on the map. Entrenchments, when finished, make it harder for enemy units to successfully attack that space. An entrenchment can't be started and completed on the same action round, so you couldn't spend 2 points to place one, then finish on that action round. It will have to wait for a future action round. At most, a player can spend 2 AP on entrenchments that round, which would mean placing up to 2, finishing up to 2, or placing 1, finishing another. Again, those points can be split with the other operations of movement and attack. So let's now talk about attack. An attack is how players knock any faction's units down in strength, out of a space, or off the map altogether, and will be very helpful in capturing spaces needed to score those coveted strategic will points. Using 1 operation point per space, The attack targets an adjacent space with enemy pieces, using as many of your units as desired in the spaces you're attacking from. And you can even advance before attack from another space to put your units adjacent to a target space, if that space you're attacking from once you move into is already friendly to your faction. So now simply add up the combat factor of all attacking and defending units to get the combined combat factor for each side. Then each faction rolls their 10-sided die, which will determine the combat effectiveness, as noted on this chart, on the player aid, and on the board itself. Multiply the combined combat factor by the combat effectiveness chart on the player aids and on the map, and apply losses. The units on either side can absorb losses based on their loss factor, that middle number on the units. One loss or hit first reduces the unit in strength, flipping it to its reduced side. Then it'll eliminate it from the map, and that unit goes into the eliminated unit boxes for that faction. For example, say the Serbians want to attack Croatians in Livno. For 3 action points, they can activate units in Sakovic, Blinstra, and Kupres. The units from Blinstra may advance before attack into Glomak as it's friendly controlled by the Serbians, putting those units adjacent to the space being targeted. That puts 7 units total, each with a combat factor of 4 from Serbia, up against 3 units of Croatia, which has combat factors of 3. So that's 28 combat factor versus 9. The players will now get a chance to play any cards that may help with their success in combat, and then roll the die to apply combat effectiveness. Let's say Serbians roll 4, Croatians a 7. That's a 1 times multiplier, so just the original 28 points for Serbians, but a 1.5 for Croatians. So now their 9 becomes a 14 as the multiplier is rounded up. But wait, notice that Livno has a terrain effect. It's a swamp. So that attacker's die roll is reduced by 2, which means Serbians only rolled a 2. The combat effectiveness is therefore cut in half. That 28 is now just 14, so the factions actually dealt equal damage. I'll get into more terrain effects shortly, but first let's resolve this battle as it is and the different permutations of it. With each side dealing 14 damage, that means the units need to absorb losses based on the loss factor available among the units. All the units in this conflict have a loss factor of 6, so the most hits either side will take is 2. A hit reduces the strength of a full strength unit or removes an already reduced strength unit to the eliminated forces box for that respective faction. In this case, both sides would want to reduce 2 full strength units rather than eliminating a unit outright, because every unit counts as a -1 strategic will loss for that side losing unit, and it gains a strategic will for the side that caused the loss. So looking at a different scenario for this battle, imagine if Croatia only rolled a 2, splitting their combat effectiveness in half, and Serbians rolled a 9. That's a critical hit, which would always cause a loss no matter what. That 9, now it's reduced to a 7 though with the terrain effects. It's now 28 times 1.5 for a total of 42. Massive. Croatia's 9 combat factor with a combat effectiveness is just 5. Not enough to cause a single hit, since all Serbian units can take up to a 6. No damage. But that 42, ouch, that's 7 hits total, more than enough to wipe out all 3 of those units off the map. That would be +3 strategic will for Serbia, -3 for Croatia. However, if Serbia's roll was, say, a 6, reduced down to a 4, then they'd cause that flat 28 in damage, which is 4 hits in total, enough to eliminate 1 unit and reduce the remaining ones. Now, because the difference in amount of hits was more than 2 for Serbia, Croatians have to retreat 2 spaces. Retreat is 1 space for 2 hits, and 2 spaces if it's more than 2 hits. That is, unless it's a swamp like Livno, in which the defender that was caused to retreat may instead take 1 more step loss to avoid retreat. But that means another lost unit for Croatia, so let's just say they don't want to suffer that loss and would rather get the hell out of there. If for whatever reason the defender can't retreat, the units are completely lost, and applying the strategic will score appropriately. And now, if the targeted space is clear of enemy units, Serbia may advance after attack into that live-no space. And if it's a mechanized unit, then it can in fact advance one more after that attack. That is, if this were a space other than the swamp like live-no, which specifies that advancing after attack, they must halt in that space. However, once again, taking into the account the FA level, if it's -3 or lower, no advance after attack would be available for that faction. They have to wait until the next turn to move in there. Or if there happened to be one unit that didn't join this attack that hadn't been activated yet this turn, they could actually be activated for movement and move in, but as you saw, we used all the strength of all the units attacking. Regardless, in this scenario, Serbia has now captured a key space, which means another +3 for Serbia and 3 less for Croatia. And of course, the blowback of -1 on the foreign attitude track for capturing that key space. As with movement, when capturing the space or key space, check the region to see if it is now controlled by the acting faction. Mark it as such and award reduce the strategic will points for that region. Returning back to terrain, there's a handy little guide on the map and on the player aid to show the effects of each. Entrenchments, as you'll notice, have a die roll modifier of +2 for the defender, -2 for the attacker. And they're cumulative, so if a player were to entrench a city, that's -6 on the attacker's die roll. Rivers are unique as their modifiers only apply if the space is being attacked solely across a river. If an enemy attacked from multiple spaces, and one didn't have the blue of the river on that side of the space, then no river effect applies. If the river does apply, note that the defender fires first, rolling the die and applying hits before the attacker applies theirs, so there's a chance to reduce the strength of that incoming attack. So those are the 3 operations that can be done in combination during an action phase by a player. Remember, the points on the card allow the player to activate that many spaces with units. All the units in those spaces are activated and they can do any of those actions, but any one unit can only do one action. They can't be activated twice on a turn. In a space with 3 units, one could move, one could start or continue an entrenchment, and another can attack, including moving into a friendly space before attack to get adjacent to an attacking space. Movement and attack may allow for more than 3 units to become momentarily stacked in one space, and that's fine, as long as at the end of the action phase, the 3-unit limit isn't exceeded. So if a 4th, 5th, or even 6th unit end up in one space via the move before an attack option, that's fine, as long as these units in excess can advance after attack into the space that's been targeted. Stacking limits are applied at the end of the player's action phase. But there's still a few more actions to cover, which will come in handy on a few turns. One is strategic redeployment. That is a way to move units across the map much more quickly than the regular movement operation. Each point on the card allows one unit to move as many spaces as possible across a continuous chain of friendly controlled spaces, respecting the stacking limit at the end of the phase. Unlike movement, that's just one unit, not all units in an activated space. And they're not limited by that movement factor. They can move clear across the board if there's enough friendly spaces chained together. But remember, if the foreign attitude track is -3 or lower, no strategic redeployment for that faction. Replacement allows the player to strengthen reduced units or bring eliminated units back onto the map. One action point allows for 2 replacement points, so a 2 card could revive 4 reduced units on the map back to full strength, or revive 2 and bring back 2 units to the reduced side, or place 2 eliminated units on the map on their full strength side, effectively bringing them on reduced and reviving them. These fresh placements must take place on key spaces controlled by that faction, and they only apply to domestic units, including those domestic elite units, but not foreign armies. Any points not used in this phase are losses that can't be carried over, and a player is not allowed to do this 2 phases in a row. Diplomatic action is a final available action, which allows a player to bump their foreign attitude back up. A 2 or a 3 card moves the track up 1 space, that's to the left. A 4 card moves it up 2 spaces. This will come in handy if your FA track starts to slip to dangerous levels because of your actions. So that's all the actions a player may take during their action phase. Now let's look at the actual flow of the game. We left off the setup with some decisions to make about reinforcements, which factions will get at the start of the turn. The turn then lasts as many action phases as it takes for all the players to play their last card, even if some players have more cards than the others, which can happen especially in that first turn. Then advance to the next turn, and when players are playing a card, that is their action phase. Reinforcements may be placed on the board within stacking limits, either on key spaces or spaces that are friendly controlled which are adjacent to their key spaces. On turn 1, the Serbian player will place all 10 reinforcements. Then Croatians place 5, Bosniaks there too. And reminder of the dice roll modifications to the Bosniaks' combat effectiveness die rolls on turns 1 and 2. Next step in the turn is to place foreign units, but players won't have any on the first turn, but turns 2 through 4 will mean that they return 1 eliminated foreign unit to the reserve box. Or flip 2 units on the map from reduced to full strength. The players may return any foreign units from the map to the reserve box, maintaining their full or reduced strength status. Any units that are not just placed in the reserve box can be deployed to their appropriate foreign spaces on the map. Keep in mind that each foreign army deployed causes this -1 shift in the foreign attitude track. Serbia could see a reduction of 2 foreign attitude steps if they deployed both the SDG and SVK armies in this step. Then we begin the action phases. Players taking turns playing cards for their events or operations. At the start of each action phase, players must first check supply to see if any of their units are out of supply. Supply can be traced through friendly controlled spaces back to the respective foreign spaces. Serbians get supply from YUG and CRA spaces. Both Croatian and Bosniaks receive supply from CRO spaces. Key spaces may also supply up to 3 units each, and they don't have to be stacked in those spaces, just be able to trace a friendly controlled supply path to that space. If any units at this point are out of supply, place a low supply marker on them. If they already had a low supply marker on them, flip that low supply to out of supply for this action phase. If they already had an out of supply marker on them at the start of this action phase, all units there receive 1 step loss. If this step loss eliminates any units, strategic will is lost and also awarded to the faction that caused the units to go out of supply. On that phase, out of supply units cannot be activated, but they can still defend if attacked in another player's phase. The acting player gets to choose which units are supplied and which aren't. But once low supply marker is placed, if that same group of units are in a low supply area, as they're only supplied by, say, key spaces on the next turn, then that unit is then out of supply. You can't move the low supply markers back and forth, mitigating this supply loss. So this won't be a problem on the first turn. But once supply is determined, then check the foreign attitude track. If any factions has their FA at -5 or -6, that's level 2, then the player to their left, or the player that caused their FA to dip that low, gets to select 2 different units of that affected player and roll their die for each unit. On a 3 or higher, the unit takes hits, either reducing or eliminating the unit. No strategic will is awarded or lost for units eliminated in this way, though. Now, the acting player continues on with their action phase, playing their cards. As mentioned, the turn is over when all cards are played, so that first turn may see a few extra action phases for the Serbian player. Play continues this way until the start of the third turn when the decks are rebuilt. Take all the discarded cards that have been played, whether for the events or operations. Remove the cards that just say Early War, and shuffle in the early-late cards with the late war cards that have been set aside. Now, turn order shifts for turns 3 and 4. It goes Bosniak, Croatian, Serbia. Once again, note the number of cards drawn, reinforcements, and proceed with the foreign unit step before getting into the action rounds. If at any point a faction's FA dips down to -7 or their strategic will to 0, they immediately lose, and the final scoring math will be applied to the remaining players. I'll go over that shortly. If a faction reaches their strategic will objective, which is 71 for Serbians, 60 for Croatians, or 55 for Bosniaks, and they've captured all their key regions available to them, they immediately win the game. If the game goes a full distance, all 4 turns, and neither faction has done so, then apply this final scoring math. Apply an initial factor of 0 for Serbians, 11 for Croatians, and 16 for Bosniaks. Then, add their final strategic will value, subtract the strategic will of any of their key regions that they don't control, then subtract 5 times the intervention level their FA track is at, which will either be 1 or 2. This may sound a little convoluted, but it's done so to obscure the score during the gameplay and avoid any king-making decisions. It makes for a more tight and tense game. The faction with the highest score wins and secures their future of their republic in the former Yugoslavia. I hope you found this video helpful and that you have the confidence to start playing Brotherhood and Unity right away. Please leave a comment if this helped or if you want to ask any further questions or discuss the game. But for now, happy gaming, and I hope to see you at the table someday.